Hello and welcome back to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, a podcast where we take the films of the Walt Disney animated classics, look at them in chronological order to assess their merits and see which ones really hold up to that title of an animated classic, albeit in our case, a Waly Gisnep animated classic. As always, I am Liam and I am joined by my very good friend Ben. Ben, what are we taking a look at today?
No films this week, Liam, so we'll just call it there, I think.
Yeah, it's weird how there was no 25th film in the animated classics. Anyway, we'll be back next week to look at The Great Mouse Detective, so remember to have a watch and join us next time.
Oh, wait, Liam, I've checked, and it is technically a film, but it's The Black Cauldron.
By the loosest definition possible, it is a film, so I suppose we have to look at it.
Yeah, we're going to 1985's The Black Cauldron, loosely based on the series of books The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander, which are based on Welsh mythology. Liam, as a Welshman yourself, are these stories that you are raised on in the land of the Wales?
They're not stories we're raised on, but there's definitely elements of the language that pop up that I'm familiar with, and unsurprisingly, it's butchered pretty badly in this series of films. Now, Lloyd Alexander clearly had a love for these folk tales and the language, so I like to think that within the books, they get it right, because a lot of the names and the language conventions do carry over to the films, but I'm just going to assume they didn't consult with Lloyd Alexander, and they just guessed at the best pronunciations of these, because it starts irritating me quite early on.
I mean, in some ways, the phrase irritating from quite early on is probably the nicest thing I'm going to say about this film. Let's be clear right from the start of this podcast, this film is atrocious. It's a car crash of a film. It's not going on the list. It's just going to be me and Liam kicking it to pieces for 45 minutes. So sit back and enjoy. We're going to tell you everything that's wrong with The Black Cauldron.
I will jump in very quickly to say there are some redeeming elements. They're brief, but they're there. Hopefully, I'll be able to touch on some of those and convince you that it's not all terrible. It's all bad, but it's not all terrible.
Liam, I have a page of notes on this. Only one comment isn't a harsh criticism. It's my second comment, and I'll read it verbatim. The backgrounds are fine.
The backgrounds are really nice, actually. The opening might lull you into a false sense of security, because the first few backgrounds you see, you're like, this is actually something quite special. We've got that same quality we saw in The Fox and the Hound. Obviously, nothing compared to what we're going to be seeing in a few films' time, but for the time, the background animation is quite good.
Let's start then by going through the plot in heavily inverted commas.
Before we get to the plot, something very special has happened here, Ben. This is the first Disney film with end credits rather than opening credits.
You're absolutely right. So you can end the pain slightly sooner than you would have been able to before.
The worst part with the end credits in this situation is after sitting through an hour and 20 minutes of this film, I want to turn it off at the soonest possible moment, so I have no idea who directed this film, who worked as animators on it. As soon as I could, I was like, right, I'm done.
So we open on the titular Black Cauldron. That's about it, visually. And there's a narrator explaining that there has been a war that has ravaged the land, and whoever can get hold of the Black Cauldron will win this war. Now, just to be clear, you will literally never see the war or any aspects of it at any point in this film. It's not made clear who this war's between, or where it's happening, or anything at all. That's it. That's the explanation you're going to get. And it sets a theme in this film where you feel like there's some information you've missed, but I can tell you, as someone who's watched this film four times, there's films I love I haven't watched 4 times. There's no explanation. There's not enough information. Sorry, I need to pace myself. We've got a whole film to get through here.
I will say I quite like the idea of the Black Cauldron as an artifact, though I will say I'm a little bit sick of every dark high fantasy being about an evil character pouring their malice into an inanimate object. Tolkien did it, and everyone just seems to be copying it. It's the go-to thing.
Yeah, as a film, this is incredibly lazy. And I know it's based on a series of novels, but if they're anything like this film, they're also incredibly lazy. In terms of it being an interesting artifact, one of my notes just is, aren't most cauldrons black? How do you know which one's which?
Well, they have that scene later on with the whole room full of cauldrons, and I think it could have been set up to be quite a nice Last Crusade moment with choose wisely. Obviously, this was before Last Crusade, but instead it's just, here's a room of cauldrons, and they're like, how are we going to find it? And the answer is, the witches are just going to give it to them.
The answer is tedious nonsense. So you get this narration, and I've just written, do you know what would make this opening more interesting? Showing literally anything that's being described. For a visual medium, it's a very uninteresting shot of a cauldron and a narrator for several minutes.
I'm now just picturing the opening of the Lord of the Rings films, but it's just Galadriel talking over a picture of the ring.
I mean, that is how the film starts initially. You get a thing of the ring and Galadriel talks, but then you get to see some other stuff. Imagine if she just described the war with Sauron and you never saw any of that. You wouldn't go, that's a much better way of doing it. No, it'd be awful. After this narration, then, we meet our main character, Taran.
Which they keep pronouncing as Taran, which is the first of the mildly irritating pronunciations. It's Taran.
We've had various English characters such as King Arthur and Friar Tuck voiced by Americans, and in this, Welsh characters are voiced by English people for some reason.
I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here and say that this isn't set in Wales. It's just based on Welsh mythology, which means that it can be set wherever, which, frankly, if this would be the one time where it would be okay to have American accents. Because it's a completely fictional place, but the one time it's not explicitly in England. Oh, we've got an English actor. Great, because English just means fantasy at this era.
So, Liam, for someone who's not seen this film, how would you describe the character of Taran?
He is consistently unheroic, inept, and just unremarkable in every way. And the idea of an unremarkable protagonist, I'm fine with. But usually there's an arc where they either discover what was always remarkable about them or something. But he just starts out as very irritating and headstrong without anything to back it up. And that never really changes.
No. I suppose the only good thing I can say about Taran in very relative terms is he does have some kind of character motivation, which is more than I can say for basically any other character in this film. I suppose the Horned King has a bit of motivation, but the other characters are so deeply flawed, and we will come to that.
I deeply dislike the feudal system. However, I have never met a peasant who I more believed is exactly in the position he deserves to be in.
At one point he says, will I... By the way, just on a side note, it's some of the worst voice acting I've ever heard. It's atrocious. Any time you think you might be able to buy into this film at all, Taran speaks and you're instantly out of it. But anyway, there's a point where he says, will I ever be more than an assistant pig keeper? And in my head I thought, no, because you're shit.
Again, there's a similar line where he just says, I'm a warrior, not a pig keeper. And I'm like, no, you're a pig keeper.
I would never ever recommend watching this film, but if you can find like 10 seconds of Taran speaking, you will see what we mean. There's times when he's like, oh no, Headwing, you're being stolen. It's awful.
You have one chance to make a first impression with your protagonist. Our protagonist is introduced to us starting a fight with a pig and a goat.
A fight that he loses.
I'm not sure who it is in Hollywood that keeps thinking that looking for a fight and brashness are admirable traits. Like, I remember the Green Lantern film. The setup to the Green Lantern film, if you've not seen it, is Ryan Reynolds is a bit of a cocky pilot, and he knows better than the people who he's doing a drill for. So he goes against the guidance to pull off a risky maneuver, and it goes wrong in some way, I can't quite remember, and it gets everyone in trouble. They lose the contract. People lose their jobs as a result of his brash actions. Later on, two people who lost their jobs as a result of this see him in a bar, punch him, and then walk away saying he's not worth it. At this point, he gets up and chooses to fight back. They've walked away and left him, but he's like, no, you don't start a fight with me, and leave it, albeit a well-deserved fight. Now, I should add at this point, the whole point of Green Lantern is it's a ring that gives you superpowers when you show strength of will. And it's at this point that the ring decides to reward him with superpowers. And I'm like, that's a terrible lesson. He deserved to be punched in the face and had no right to continue the fight with these people. Now imagine that with the fairly interesting set pieces and the characters in the fight, but instead it's a pig farmer getting beaten up by a goat.
I just want to point out here, Liam has referenced The Green Lantern, a film that is widely considered to be bad, and made it sound good compared to The Black Cauldron. That's the gift that this film is. So this pig is no ordinary pig because, for reasons that will never be explained or looked into, this pig is psychic.
Do you remember when I suggested that the worst inciting incident of a film is an old lady leaving her money to the cats?
I do.
It actually turns out the worst inciting incident is magical fortune-telling pig.
And you're right, this is the inciting incident. So, Taran's an assistant pig keeper. The head pig keeper, the senior pig keeper, I suppose he's just pig keeper. The pig keeper says, but this is no ordinary pig because this pig has visions. And basically what you do is if you sort of half drown the pig, it creates these images, and it creates these vague images, and in doing that, they draw the attention of the Horned King. Much in the same way as in Lord of the Rings, when you put the ring on, it attracts Sauron's attention. I say much in the same way. It's clearly stolen from that.
No. They don't draw the attention of the Horned King. The vision tells them that the Horned King has somehow become aware of Henwin's powers, which Dolben says, I'm the only person who knew. How is this possible? And I'm like, I'd like to know how that's possible. Will the film tell us? No, it won't.
That's the inciting incident. The Horned King wants a psychic pig to find the Black Cauldron. You might feel like I'm strawmanning it. That's the explanation that we get. And this scene made me realise the entire approach this film uses, which we often talk about using show, don't tell. You're in a visual medium, that's the best way to tell a story. Certainly in animation, which is all about images. This film doesn't go for show, don't tell. It goes for tell, don't show, but tell it in a shit way.
There's so many better ways to get to this point, and I imagine in the book it may be elaborated on, but in adaptation clearly something has been lost and we just have a magical pig that now needs to be hidden from the Horned King.
And for whatever reason, Torben, the pig keeper, decides that the best way to do this is to send Taran to a cottage, I think. It's not really clear. He never gets there, so it doesn't really matter, I suppose. And Taran sees this as his calling, and he thinks that by hiding a pig, he's gonna become a hero. I don't know why he thinks that, but he does. There's not much precedent for it. But again, what really annoys me is, in this scene, Taran says, I want to be a warrior, and Torben's like, you don't want to get involved in that fool war. We don't see the war. We only see about 3 other people in this film. I suppose there's some generic henchmen, but in terms of human characters, we don't see any. There's no evidence that there's even a civilization other than Torben and Taran. It's weird.
I'm beginning to think that maybe Dolben told the Horned King about Henwin, so it gave him an excuse to send Taran away.
I buy into that, except for the fact that I don't think Torben would bother to show him the psychic pig. Just get a normal pig and say, listen, can you just go to the cottage? In fact, don't even take the pig. If you can just go to the cottage and just stay there indefinitely, please. Frankly, you cause more harm than good.
Please stop assaulting my goat.
Yeah, you assaulted my goat, you burned my food, you fell over in the mud. It's been 5 minutes. Just stop.
He burns his finger as well. One of the first things he does after this fight is burns his finger. We're constantly being told that this character is inept. And then Dolben entrusts this pig of great importance. What's there's a line, isn't there? How is it they refer to the pig at one point?
It's my favourite line in this film. The Horned King, who is voiced by John Hurt, who has an excellent voice anyway, and they've put a load of reverb and stuff, so he's got this really deep, gravelly voice. And he says, with all sincerity,
You are the keeper of this oracular pig.
which at some point someone had to write down and say, I think that's a good line of dialogue.
So yes, this inept character, and Dolben decides to entrust his oracular pig to Taran, and immediately Taran loses him.
It's a matter of minutes. We do get a very brief scene in the middle where we're introduced to the Horned King, and he doesn't do anything. Like, he just moves around his castle very slowly. He's got like this weird green henchman. I don't know if the henchman's meant to be sort of comic relief or what. If he is, he's not funny.
The Horned King is, I think, a really interesting design in concept. However, in execution, he only ever looks about half drawn.
You're right, I was really trying to put my finger on this. I think it's all down to the colouring, in that they've tried to make him really sort of dark and in these muted shades, but it just makes him look like he's part of the background. In fact, what he looks like is, you notice it a lot in animation where there'll be a bookshelf and the one book they're going to take out is coloured slightly differently. He looks like he's been coloured as one of the parts of the background that's going to move rather than an actual character in and of himself. And again, I think they could have done stuff with lighting, so have him like move in and out of shadows, but it's just like, oh, we're just going to make it look dark and dull all the time.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's the lighting is always off with him. And in fact, I will say that the design of the Horned King changed several times, and it wouldn't surprise me if the final design was a really late addition and is quite rushed. But again, I think they made the right decision. I think the design is fantastic. From the standpoint of dark 80s animated fantasy, I don't think you're going to get much more cool and sinister than the Horned King, but the execution is terrible.
I think a lot of people, particularly of our generation, or maybe younger, are easily suckered into this film and thinking this is like a dark side of Disney, and it was that dark 80s fantasy. It's the first Disney feature not to have any songs in it at all. It's got this different visual style. I think if you watch the trailer or see the poster, you think it's going to be this dark and gritty film, but actually it's toothless and weird and confused. You'll have more fun watching the trailer than watching the film.
On that note, I think it's worth touching on a little bit of historical context here, because this is released in the middle of the 80s. We're at the height of D&D and the satanic panic. We've got high fantasy is one of the most popular genres for television and properties to adapt. So I can imagine Disney were like, right, we need to find a property that's not been done yet. And they found these Lloyd Alexander books. And it was, yeah, great, we'll do these. But the problem is when you're adapting those books, a lot of fantasy from the 70s and 80s, it's really dense. Lots of characters, lots of high concept plots. Adapting that into a 75-minute animation aimed at children, it's a hard ask. On top of that, this really isn't their comfort zone. I know that Don Bluth was having quite a lot of success with some of his more darker tones. We have things like The Secret of Nim, I think, had came out by this point, which really nails that tone, but it's an original story and it isn't high fantasy, so it's not being bogged down by that. And this feels like Disney trying to compete in an area they have no business being in.
My reference point is that this came out in 1985. In 1986, Studio Ghibli released Castle in the Sky.
Wow.
So there's a huge discrepancy here in terms of quality. But even with all that in mind, I don't think the problems of this film are Disney trying to do something different or the tone being wrong necessarily. Clearly you've got a group of talented animators, and the films either side of this have that darkness to them. You know, we've already talked about The Rescuers and The Fox and the Hound, and coming up we've got Basil the Great Mouse Detective, and even Oliver and Company, which has many problems of its own, but is clearly trying to do something a bit more grounded and a bit more gritty. I don't think this is why this film fails. I think it fails on some really basic mechanical levels. I think the scripting and the narrative don't make any sense, or they're just lacking, and I think the characterization is absolutely appalling. As we've already talked about, Taran is the most well-rounded character, and he's so incredibly unlikable and uninteresting. It's very hard to connect to this film on any level.
Talking about unlikable and uninteresting.
Oh, God.
After Taran loses Henwin, he is immediately accosted by a small hairy man.
It's Gurgi.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the American comedian Rip Taylor, but I refuse to believe that Gurgi is not in some way based on Rip Taylor, because he looks just like him.
This is wholeheartedly the truth. I genuinely and involuntarily flinched when Gurgi appeared on the screen, even though I knew he was coming. That's how repulsive a character he is. I've also just written a note that says, "What is he?" ? And so, again, feel free to Google it. Because you say a little man. I don't think he is a little man. The best description I've got is he's like Gollum, but he's got Geppetto's hair and he's combined with a really shit dog. That's the best I've got.
Not only does he have Geppetto's hair, he's got Geppetto's moustache.
Yeah, he does actually, you're right.
Maybe this is Geppetto's punishment for playing God.
I think Geppetto was punished enough in Pinocchio. God knows what Gurgi is. I think in the books he's more sort of like a muddy, covered in leaves, kind of sort of hermit type creature that's implied to sort of be of the trees. But in this, he's just a cross between a monkey and a dog.
Like a Stig of the Dump kind of situation.
Yeah.
He's a hairy Gollum, and it doesn't really work. I say he's a hairy Gollum. He's a hairy Peter Jackson Gollum, which is obviously years later, so I can't really say they were plagiarising from the future. But it does feel that way.
But I could forgive the visual design of Gurgi, but the way he talks is incredibly irritating. He's got this high-pitched voice and has all these annoying ways of wording stuff, like he calls food munchings and crunchings. He's completely pointless as a character. Even though he is critical to what happens in the plot, I would still say you could cut him and the film would be just as good / bad.
I completely forgot about the end. I was like, yeah, he's completely pointless. Oh, wait, no, he's not. Yeah, he's incredibly irritating. The fact that he's on screen with Taran and is still the most irritating character on screen, that says a lot.
And this interaction serves no purpose. So basically, Gurgi comes out and he's like wanting food and... So he steals an apple off Taran, and then there's a whole bit of a thing with the apple, and you're not missing anything, I promise.
During this whole encounter, I'm just thinking, shouldn't Taran just go and look for the pig? He's faffing about with Gurgi, and it's not as if Gurgi's holding him up. He just stays and faffs about with him.
It's important to remember, though, Taran is terrible at everything. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And Gurgi says he knows where the pig is, but he doesn't know where the pig is.
What happens in what is going to become a pattern in this film is they just kind of stumble into the next scene. And Gurgi and Taran are wandering about when they go into an opening that Henwin just happens to be in. Again, Gurgi didn't know where she was. They just wandered and looked upon where Henwin was, at which point some Nazgul fly in and steal Henwin and take her away to the Horned King's castle. And immediately what I have to say, and I can't believe this hasn't come up earlier, is the character outlines in this film are terrible at times.
Yeah, they're all over the place. Sometimes they're incredibly thick on characters. It's really, really bad. Another thing I noticed during this rewatch, I was really trying to quantify why this film is bad, rather than just telling people it's bad. And another aspect of the visuals that it's not something you pick up on straight away, but once you notice it, you go, yes, that's one of the reasons this looks so bad, is the editing's really choppy. And what I mean by that is between shots, characters' positioning will have changed just too much. And it's really, really jarring when a character, they're stood up straight, let's say, and the next scene they've got their arms out. There's no time's passed, and it just looks messy.
It's almost as if it was edited by someone who wasn't a trained editor.
But surely not, Liam.
So this is a very important film in the history of Disney, in that it is the first film to have any involvement from the brand new head of animation, Jeffrey Katzenberg.
Now, would you say he approached this role with a degree of reverence that you might when approaching the role of being responsible for the Disney Animation Studios?
Jeffrey Katzenberg's one and only goal was to attain the reverence and status of Walt Disney himself, without really doing any of the work that Walt Disney did. So when he joined the Disney company, it was at a time where the theme parks were booming, the live action films were booming. A lot of the TV stuff they were doing was successful as well. Animation was failing, and he said, I want to go in animation. I want to be able to turn this around and make a name for myself. And in his defense, eventually he did. I think a large part of the success of the Renaissance era is down to Jeffrey Katzenberg. I'm not going to overlook his role in that. But he didn't really have much respect for the animation department in its current state. And one thing he did for the Black Cauldron was he just went into an editing suite and decided to put together a version of the film. Now, CEO Michael Eisner was not happy about this, that he just sort of went over everyone else's heads in the studio and was like, I'll do it myself, mainly because he's not an editor. And it's definitely not the version they used, but he had notes, and I imagine, based on what I'm aware with Jeffrey Katzenberg, that a lot of his edits probably made it into the film. Like, if your boss hands you a version of a film that they've just put together, and then their boss tells you to re-edit the film, what do you do?
Well, you do what Ron Clements and John Musker did and go, we're just going to make a different film. One that's not terrible.
Honestly, if you have even a passing interest in animation, and particularly Disney animation, there are biographies of various animators and directors who worked at Disney during this period, and they're all fascinating because the behind-the-scenes stuff is just bizarre.
And this leads us on to another weird visual choice. So I don't really know how else to describe this. Basically, Taran and Gurgi are looking down on the Horned King's castle, and they're done in the animation style of the rest of this film, but the background, as far as I can tell, it's real footage of a cloudscape, and then they've put this weird neon trippy filter over it. So there's animated characters stood in front of like a neon 80s sky. It never appears elsewhere in the film as far as I can tell, and it's such a weird choice.
It looks really bad as well.
Oh, for sure. I mean, just assume whenever I'm talking about anything, it looks really bad.
It does help explain why there's like a harsh haze and a blue light behind the outlines in a lot of these scenes, and it's probably the method they're doing. Again, I'm not sure if it's inexperienced animators, poor editing, lack of budget. Throughout this film, you're constantly reminded that you're looking at various pictures assembled in layers, and it just takes you out of the film. Not that there's much to be taken out of, but...
So, Taran realises he's going to have to sneak into the Horned King's castle, and Gurgi's too scared he won't go and join him. He says it's basically death. And it made me realise that I have no idea who the Horned King is or what he wants. I know he wants the Black Cauldron, right? We've been told that 3 or 4 times at this point in the film, but I don't know why or what that achieves. And I was thinking about other Disney films that we've talked very highly about. The Jungle Book, where you don't see the villain for a very long time, but you have a very clear idea of who they are, what they want, and how dangerous they are. Or a film like Sleeping Beauty, where the villain just literally just appears out of thin air and does some villainous stuff. But you still get what Maleficent's about, even though she's only on screen for a few minutes. I don't know what the Horned King's plan is. I don't know anything about him other than that he's got some very questionable henchmen. That's literally it.
I want to know what the Horned King is as well.
Yeah, exactly. I've written no explanation of who the Horned King is, and then my second note is, or who anyone is.
Or why anyone follows him, because in his castle he has this whole horde of barbarians and a belly dancer, I think. And yeah, it's a fairly thriving castle. There's lots of people there. They go into a room at one point and there's a chef. Not a Louis in Little Mermaid kind of chef, but just a barbarian with meat, I suppose.
Louis in Little Mermaid, I can tell you what he wants from life in the 2 or 3 minutes he's in that film. The Horned King is one of the main characters in this film, and I don't know anything about him. So Taran sneaks his way in somehow. I was going to say he climbs up a toilet. He doesn't. There's just a hole in a wall, but that's how I remembered it for some reason. Maybe it is a toilet. And he sees that Henwin, the psychic pig, has been kidnapped and put in some very draconian chains. I don't think that pig's going to get away. Don't worry about it, guys. And basically, the Horned King wants to use this pig's psychic ability to work out where the Black Cauldron is. Fine, I guess. And Taran sees that they're going to hurt Henwin, so he gives his position away and falls down, and he's asked if he is the keeper of the oracular pig.
You are the keeper of this oracular pig.
After this, Taran decides to use Henwin's power to show the Horned King where the Black Cauldron is. So far, the only 2 things he promised Dolbin is that he won't fail him getting Henwin to the cottage, and he won't let the Horned King use Henwin's power. We're about 10 minutes into the film now, and both of those have been broken.
Now, I know I keep banging on about the Horned King's motivation, but I said a few minutes ago that the only thing I know about him is that he wants the Black Cauldron. And yet when Henwin has her vision, he says, the cauldron, so it's real. So his whole plan to get it was based on, I don't even know if it's real or not.
all of these barbarians following him out of what I assume is fear. But again, that's me putting in more work than the film is doing. They must just be sitting there going, wait, what? All of this based on just a myth?
Well, you'd think so, but yeah, there's no reaction from them. And much later on, when his plan, comes to fruition, they all run away because they're like, oh wait, I didn't know this was going to happen. So clearly he didn't know what his plan was, and they didn't know what his plan was either. Bad villaining on all parts. Also, at one point when Henwin isn't playing ball, they go, well, I have no use for you, and there's just a pig executioner on standby with an axe and a chopping block. Is he always there? Do they get through a lot of pigs? Who knows?
Also, actually, in this scene, and this is a problem with the animation, either the Horned King has been drinking water, or they get Henwin to tell the future in a bucket of wine. And I'm not sure which it is.
Well, I thought he was drinking wine from a goblet, and then Henwin splashes water on him, and that seems to hurt him. And I was like, this guy's rubbish.
But the water in the dish is the same colour as the wine in his glass. Which actually, now you mention it, if it is the wine and the wine hurts him, why was he drinking it?
I know as part of this podcast, we often deliberately poke holes in the plots and gaps in logic and stuff. But yeah, they're making it too easy this time. It's harder to make it make sense.
So after splashing some water on the Horned King, Taran runs away, and as is his MO, he just is consistently saved by dumb luck. Barbarians will chase him and they'll trip over something.
Honestly, I've got a comment later on, but it's basically the plot in this film is almost exclusively advanced by people falling over. Taran revealed himself by falling over, by the way, and the water was splashed on the Horned King by Henwin falling over. So I'm not exaggerating, that's literally how the plot expands.
Taran manages to take Henwin to the top of the castle. Don't know why he just didn't go to the toilet that he came in from. He's like, oh, well, the moat is our only chance. And he just throws Henwin over the wall. And the way she is animated, it looks like she's falling to her death. Like, this pig clearly has no idea what's going on. Why didn't he just jump with the pig? If I was somewhere with, let's say, a dog, and I'm trying to save this dog, I'm not going to throw the dog and then jump in afterwards. I'm going to hold the dog whilst I jump.
I mean, aside from previous comments about Taran being terrible at everything, the best explanation I've got is he was like, okay, I'm going to say that I'm doing this to save the pig, whereas actually, I'm going to see if the pig survives this fall before I commit to jumping.
Unfortunately, in his delay, Taran is captured by the barbarians and sent to the dungeon, where he will presumably and hopefully die.
Why they capture him rather than just kill him, who knows? They were perfectly happy to kill him a few minutes ago. The best explanation I've got is that they've decided that they need Henwin, and they can't get Henwin to use her powers without Taran there, I guess. But again, that's me inferring that's never made clear.
It also just reinforces the point that executioner is specifically a pig executioner, because he was ready to go.
Yeah, maybe they were like, right, we're going to kill this kid. Like, well, I only do pigs, so... Whilst he's imprisoned,
dumb luck strikes again.
We get introduced to Princess Alonwe and a glowing ball that sometimes follows her.
Oh yeah, there's a ball in this.
It's like Navi from Legend of Zelda, right? So it just kind of floats around, but I swear that ball just isn't in some of the scenes. And then, like, at the end of the film where they're walking away, I was like, oh yeah, and there's that glowing ball. It doesn't do anything in the film, basically. As with most characters in this film, it does nothing. I don't know why it's there. Another
point about Eilonwy is she has probably the worst audio syncing I've seen ever. Definitely in a high-budget studio animation. It's awful. Nothing she says in the film lines up with her mouth movements.
Just on a side note, her voice acting is also terrible.
As a general aside, everyone other than John Hurt in this film is, at the very least, mediocre.
And John Hurt isn't good by John Hurt standards, right? John Hurt has a good voice. He's not giving a good performance.
No, John Hurt just shows up and is John Hurt, and that's enough to be the best voice actor in this film.
I'll just get the questions out of the way. We never have an explanation of where she's a princess of. We don't know why she's in the castle. We don't know where she's trying to get to. She asks if Taran will help her escape. It seems like she's already escaped and she's helping Taran, but, you know, we have to enforce gender norms and we've been told Taran's the hero, so I guess he's helping her escape, although that's not really what's going on.
We are told, actually, that she was kidnapped by the Horned King because he thought her glowing orb could tell her where the Black Cauldron is, which I'm not sure what information he was given, because all it is a glowing orb.
As far as I can tell, he's just trying his luck here. He's just going, oh, vaguely mystical thing, I'll just get it and maybe things will happen, I don't know. And this leads into probably the best sequence of the film, which is a sort of extended escape sequence. During this, they pick up a very irritating old bard. His gimmick is that he has a harp where the strings snap whenever he lies. Nothing comes of that.
Yeah, so again, the Horned King kidnapped him because he had a magical artifact and he thought it might help. I'm not sure what the Horned King was thinking, other than like getting a big gridded map out and going, is it here? Snap. Is it here? Snap.
But then we get into some interesting epistemological ideas of, is it lying if he believes it's true? I don't know. But I would also argue that having this harp is worse than not having this harp, because it basically removes your ability to lie. That's the only magical effect it confers on its owner.
That's a very good point, actually, because there's a moment later in the film where he offers to trade it away as if it has value. And if anything, it's like, I really want to get rid of this harp.
The only value it has is tricking other people who don't know what it does into using it so you can tell if they're lying. I think he's meant to be a comedy character. Again, he contributes nothing to the plot and he's very irritating. As if we didn't have enough irritating side characters already.
One thing I really love about Feud is that it's clear from his animation, and this is the case actually for a few characters in this film, but Disney brought Milk Carl out of retirement for this film to work on some of the characters, and I'm like, imagine this ending up being your final film.
Yeah, because I think originally his plan was to end on Madame Medusa, and that was going to kind of be his magnum opus.
Yeah, so all of these iconic character designs in these frankly brilliant films. What a career. And they're like, can you come back and design an annoying bard and a princess? And he's like, I'm quite old now. I'm not really going to put much effort in. It's just Aurora, but worse.
She always reminds me of the version of Princess Zelda from the CDI games.
She does look like that, actually.
This extended escape sequence, I'd say it's the highlight of the film. I wouldn't say it's good or worth watching, but I'd say it's, in relative terms, the best part of it. That said, it feels like it should be the climax of the film, because this is like an action set piece, and normally in a film you get sort of one at the start, one in the middle, and one at the end, right? And you'll get sort of three main set pieces in the film. And I can see this being one in the middle, but there's not one at the start or the end of the film, so having the best part of the film in the middle feels really weird.
I suppose our start action set piece is Henwin getting kidnapped by the weird dragon creatures.
But I'd say that's after the inciting incident. I'd say the opening action set piece is Taran losing a fight to a goat.
So talking of action, the source of the action in this sequence is something I'm never quite sure how I feel about. It's a magical sword that does all the work for Taran.
I mean, in some ways, it's the perfect weapon for him. Literally, he finds it in a box, it swings itself, it does all the work. I think any other sword he would have ended up killing himself with by accident.
You don't even need to be holding the sword for it to work. There are several moments where it just floats and starts attacking things, and not wanting to lose out, Taran grabs on as if to somehow claim credit.
That's exactly it. I think Alonwi could have escaped fine and found the sword herself. She'd have probably done better than Taran. The sword could have probably just escaped by itself.
Alonwi probably would have left the sword instead of grave robbing for it.
The floating orb could probably have escaped, because I think there's just windows it could have just flown out of. The bard would have died, no problem, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
Yeah, it's such a weird sequence, because again, with the sword, it's kind of one-size-fits-all solution. If they don't know what to do if they're stuck, Taran just swings it and it will provide an answer. So they're caught at a gate at one point, so he just swings the sword redirects itself to a rope and opens the door, and then they run away. It's ridiculous, because he's like, this is my ticket to being a great warrior. And it's like, no, this is your ticket to going from being a pig keeper to a sword keeper.
Imagine what that sword could do with someone vaguely competent holding it.
Well, we saw. They become a king and conquer an entire land.
Yes, that's true. But they manage to escape by tomfoolery and luck and oafishness, and then they're just wandering around in the countryside. And I've got a note that I've just written, Christ, this is bad.
Yeah, so our trio of heroes, are recovering from their ordeal. Taran is gloating because he saved them and is like, oh, it takes a great warrior to wield a sword like this. And it's like, no, it doesn't. It literally does it all by itself. And Eilonwy rightfully points this out and is like, well, I think anyone could use a sword like that, to be honest, let alone a redundant pig farmer. She doesn't say that. She should have said that. And immediately just quips back with, well, what would a girl like you know about a sword like this? As if we didn't already hate this character enough. He's the misogynist as well.
Eilonwy is the one who saved him. She's a princess. She probably knows more about magical swords than you do, you idiot.
There is nothing redeeming about Taran. We'll get to one redeeming point, actually, later, but it's not much.
It honestly feels like, aside from what we've talked about, where they've felt that young boys will really identify with Taran and they'll be like, oh, I could be a hero as well, even though I have a shitty life or whatever it is. And it's like they've gone, right, okay, we need a big evil villain and a princess and a sword and a bard and all these wacky creatures. And the film technically does have all those things in, but in the most perfunctory, tokenistic way. It doesn't gel together. None of these elements add anything. They're just there because that's the genre they're doing.
I'll also add that all of the individual elements are, in their own right, terrible.
Oh, absolutely.
The bard is annoying. The villain is very flat. The princess is there. We're not given any information. She is just there to be tick box princess.
Often people use the phrase greater than the sum of its parts. I'd say this has a series of very irritating or ineffective parts that somehow manage to be even worse than they should be when combined.
It's a multiplicative effect with the terribleness. One last point on the box ticking. They seem to have shoehorned in a bit of tension between Taran and Eilonwy, as if this is a potential romantic interest. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for these characters. It doesn't land. It's just there.
Yeah, it's not in the writing, and it's definitely not in the performances, because as discussed, they're just read in a flat monotone. This scene is probably the most time we get to spend with these characters just as them being characters and interacting with each other. I'd say it's like being at the funeral of someone you don't know. You can tell there should be an emotional reaction, but you feel nothing.
And as if the scene couldn't get any worse, in the tradition of the plot just kind of happening to these characters, Gurgi shows up again.
How did he find them? Don't know. What's he been doing? Don't know.
I just have a note that I enjoy when Feud says toddle off to Gurgi. Just a nice little...
That's it. That's the extent of the praise.
Hey, I said there were things I like in this film. That's one of them.
So Gurgi says he does know where Henwin is this time, and he says he's going to take them there. So with basically nothing better to do, the characters decide to follow Gurgi again.
Now, I'm not sure if Gurgi actually knew where Henwin was, or as with the rest of the film, they just stumble into shit again. Because I think they find pig tracks, which I'm going to say it's Gurgi's lucky day that he just happened to lead them to pig tracks. And they go to this pool, and I think they just assume that Henwin drowned herself.
Doesn't one of them fall into the pool?
Yeah, everyone falls.
It's just falling over is how things happen in this film.
They fall into the pool, and this triggers a whirlpool that drags all of them down now into this underwater, as in literally under the water, cave where a bunch of very annoying fairies live who have the worst animation on their wings ever. It just looks like static.
Yeah, and these are voiced, initially anyway, by clearly very young children. How would you rate them on Liam's child voice actor shitness scale?
These are the worst ones so far. These are right at the bottom.
Worse than Thumper.
Worse than Thumper. This is what you have to beat to hit the lowest of the low now. They're just terrible. I can't even understand them half the time.
They stumble into this fairy's secret cave. The fairies seem very shocked by this, despite the fact if these idiots by pure accident have found it, it can't be that well hidden. And the fairies reveal that they do indeed have Henwin and she's alive and well. And our characters ask about the Black Cauldron, and they say you need to go to Morva to find the Black Cauldron. And they say, you go there, don't worry, we'll make sure Henwin gets home. And I was thinking, these fairies definitely plan on eating Henwin.
Well, no, they do get Henwin back to Dalban,
They do, but I think they had to change their plan after that point.
which is pointless because either take her where she was supposed to be in hiding in the cottage, or keep her there.
Both excellent points. Taryn could point out that she's not safe there, but, we stopped caring at this point.
Also, the party pick up yet another member in one of the fairies decides to join them to show them the way. I'm just sick of being introduced to bad characters.
So this is Grouchy Fairy, right? That's the extent of it. He doesn't have like a motivation or a character arc. He barely has a plot function. He's just there. Again, presumably in the books, this character has stuff going on. They were like, we can't have the film without this character, but we also don't have time to give them anything interesting to do. So we'll just stick them in there. They're in there for a couple of minutes, move on.
So they begin the long, treacherous adventure to Morva. Only kidding, they get there immediately.
Now, I've been to Morva. They've got a TK Maxx. So...
Wait, is this a real place?
Yeah, it's in Wales.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember exactly how they get to the next plot point once they get to Morva, but I've written something about falling over, so I assume someone falls over something again.
So they find a hut, and they just barge into the hut. They open a chest, of which hundreds of frogs come out. And again, in tell don't show fashion, we're told they weren't frogs, they were people, which would have been a really good point in an animation to have some nice little body horror. Let's maybe have one of the frogs talk and explain that. But no, just see some frogs hop away and it's like, they were people. And I'm like, okay, not people I care about. Maybe they're people who fled the war. And then they go into the back room and see just hundreds of black cauldrons. And this is the scene I was referring to earlier. And they're like, how will we possibly find out which it is? At which point the Fates from Hercules show up.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. They're just the same characters, except worse.
Again, Hercules came later, so clearly Musker and Clements, I think, took inspiration from an earlier project of theirs. But yeah, they're not good. They've got names. I don't remember them.
And you may be wondering, wait, why are we looking for the Black Cauldron? Because wasn't the whole thing to hide Henwin from the Horned King, and now we're looking for the Black Cauldron? Great questions. We don't have answers to them.
Oh yeah, at what point did they decide they were going to get the Black Cauldron and destroy it?
Is it something the fairies say, or do they say it after they escape? Like, honestly, it's so tenuous and vague. But yeah, they've decided they're going to find the Black Cauldron.
Maybe it was just an idea Taran had while he was throwing Henwin off the roof. I'll get the Black Cauldron and I'll destroy it. I'll throw it off this roof.
Will I ever be more than an assistant pig keeper? He said, throwing a pig off a castle. Why aren't people promoting me in my only job? Now, I hate these witches, Liam, for so many reasons.
My main reason for hating them is that they have terrible taste in men.
Yeah, so there's this whole extended sequence of one of them who they've really emphasised the fact she's busty. That's like her character trait. And she falls for the bard. I mean, he's like this ugly, irritating old man, but I guess he's the only other grown man in the world, so fine.
Yeah, they're not great. And again, the only purpose they seem to serve is for the heroes to trip into more plot. I don't think they know there are these witches. If they had been told to find the cauldron, you must seek out these witches, that's fine. But instead, they go to this hut and go, why does anyone need so many cauldrons? And then suddenly these witches appear. And it's like, okay, just again, our heroes do nothing heroic and the plot keeps moving forwards.
And in another fantasy film, maybe the witches would set them a trial they have to complete or a quest to go on. In this, they just say, you just have to give us something. That's the extent of it. One of them says, no one has asked for the Black Cauldron in over 2,000 years. And I was thinking, certainly not in my house they haven't.
So yes, they say, we will show you the way to the Black Cauldron, but you're going to have to trade. Each character offers to trade something. Eilonwy doesn't actually. She isn't like, here, take my magical orb of nondescript magical power. Probably because it wasn't in the scene.
I'll let all these peasants and weird creatures offer their petty belongings while I, as a princess, just sit back and let them do it.
Instead, the witches ask for the magical sword because they see how powerful it is. And Taran, reluctantly knowing it's the only way to get the Black Cauldron, offers to trade it away. It is the only good thing he does in the film, because he sees this sword as his ticket to being a warrior, which is what we're told his goal. So this is something he could use to achieve that goal, but instead there's something more important. I'm going to have to give the sword away. But it feels so hollow because we've not seen him develop as a result of the sword. Like, if maybe we'd spent more time with him and the sword had taught him things about being a warrior, and he's like, but it's got so much more to teach me still. Again, this is the scene in which the sword acts on its own and he grabs on to take credit for it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Or if it was a case of he'd had to earn the sword and this sword represented his journey so far. But no, bumbles into it, it does all the work, and then 5 minutes later he goes, I'm going to have to get rid of my magic sword. And again, in terms of pacing and structure, this is weird, because I think the character arc they're trying to go for is, at the start of the film, Taran wants all this glory and to be this incredible warrior, and then he finds the easy route to that, but then actually he finds out that being a true warrior is all about doing the right thing and not necessarily having the glory. I think that's what this is meant to represent, but if that's the case, why does this happen half an hour before the end of the film? There's still loads of things that need to happen, so it's weird that this is where that moment happens.
I can almost buy it as an end of second act sacrifice in a way. It's that going into the final act at your lowest point. Again, that only makes sense if he had achieved anything because of the sword. It's like in an Iron Man film, he loses the suit at one point probably, and he's got to do it without the suit for the finale. That happens in one of them, surely. I know it happens in Spider-Man, actually. That's a good comparison. In fact, this exact plot is done so much better in Spider-Man Homecoming.
Liam, clearly you haven't seen any Iron Man films. That's literally the finale of the first Iron Man film.
And it's so easy to make a change to make it work. You hit on it earlier. Let's have it be explicit that the sword awakens something in Taran. Let's have the other characters try to use the sword and it doesn't react to them. He's the only one that has the power to wield it. It's the Ryan Reynolds magic ring thing. Anyone else, it wouldn't work, but the sword literally does it on his own.
It's literally the same as the sword in the stone, except he doesn't pull it out of the stone, it flies out of the stone and comes to Arthur. That's what it would be the same as.
So yeah, he trades it away and the witches take the sword and disappear. The sound design of the scene is quite nice, I've got to admit. I think it's a nice little sequence where the Black Cauldron erupts from the ground and it's this big imposing thing, like they've found the MacGuffin of the film. And they just kind of camp next to it, trying to figure out what to do next.
Yeah, the witches say that there's actually no way to destroy the Black Cauldron, so their original plan has failed. The only thing they can do is to take the power away from the cauldron, and the only way to do that is to climb inside it, which is so stupid when I say it out loud. But if you do climb inside the cauldron, you die.
The pedant in me would get really annoyed if they were like, there's no way to destroy the cauldron. And I'm like, oh no, all of this has been for nothing. You can only remove its power. Well, that's fine. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, we wanted to destroy it, but for it to keep its power. So this is the opposite of what we wanted.
Really, I wanted two halves of a very powerful cauldron.
You mentioned the sound design, and aside from the actual voice acting and the editing, I think the score in this film is fine. I think it's sort of your generic 80s fantasy music. I wouldn't say it's particularly memorable, but it's certainly not bad either.
And so our heroes have hit their lowest point. They've lost their magical sword that does all the work for them. They've got the Black Cauldron, but they've been told they can't do anything with it unless one of them is willing to sacrifice themselves. And now they must try and figure out what to do next. Oh wait, never mind. The Horned King has found them, has kidnapped them.
Why does he kidnap them? Don't know. I had a tenuous explanation as to why he held Taran prisoner rather than killing him earlier, because he needs Taran to use Henwin to find the Black Cauldron. He's found the Black Cauldron. Why does he need them alive?
I think he might say that he intends for them to see him achieve victory, proving that he is incredibly petty, that these people that escaped his castle and spilt water on his face, rather than just killed him, he's like, no, they must see my victory, and he chains them up in the same room as the cauldron.
I will make them suffer. I will chain them up and make them watch the Black Cauldron.
And so the Horned King has achieved his victory. He can finally start the war he wanted to start, but is apparently already happening. And we see that what the Black Cauldron does is, if you sacrifice something into it, it gives you the power to resurrect dead people using goop.
We don't really get a clear explanation. Basically, the Horned King, he's got all these dead soldiers. They're like skeletons that are in armour and stuff, and he dumps one of them in the cauldron, and then the rest kind of come to life, and they're marching out of his castle. It's really hard to get any kind of perspective on what's happening, because he goes up to his tower and he's watching them march across the drawbridge, and he says, only moments away from victory. But it's like, victory over what? Like, we haven't seen a city. We've only seen, like, a single pig keeper. Outside of this castle, right? That's the only human being we've seen that isn't currently in this castle. So where are they going and what they're doing? As far as we know, they're just marching out into the wasteland that is Wales. I'm not saying Wales is a wasteland, but in this film, that's what it's presented as.
Maybe it is just Dalban. He's just sent a horde of skeletons to just beat up an old man. In fact, you're right. You said he puts one of the skeletons into the Black Cauldron and that activates its power. A much better sequence is him taking one of his henchmen and putting them in. It is an unwilling sacrifice activates the power of the Black Cauldron. That makes more sense as opposed to just some bones.
Yep, that would make way more sense. And then it would also make sense why his henchmen then run away, because they see what's been done and they go, oh, we didn't sign up for the undead. Or have him force them all in and turn them into undead soldiers because they're more powerful. That would have been more creepy. Just some explanation of what the hell's going on. But fine, that's what we get, you know, and as you say, our quote-unquote heroes are forced to watch.
I will say another positive of this film is I do like that throughout the film we keep cutting to the Horned King just amassing bodies. It's a common fantasy trope, but I like when villains just sort of collect corpses. It's dark in the right ways. And again, it's a common fantasy trope, but I think it's done well. And you're like, oh, what is he doing here? Why is he collecting corpses? I mean, it's fairly obvious he wants an army of the undead. I think they even say that in the opening, stupidly. But that bit of storytelling of him just progressively collecting more corpses, and then there's this final moment where the only thing he's missing is the cauldron. He gets it. That should be good, and it falls very flat.
I think there should be a scene of the Knights of the Realm marching on his castle and then seeing these undead abominations pouring out, and some stay and fight and are defeated because these things are unkillable, and others flee, and he's going to be able to take over the capital and capture the king who's Alonwi's dad. But nope, none of that happens.
I think I quite like the animation on the actual skeleton, so I like the green smoke. However, there is an echo effect that they use which looks absolutely crap.
I think the sequence has CGI in as well. I know The Black Cauldron is the first Disney film to use any CGI at all, and it's fine. I think this is probably one of the best uses of CGI given the state it was at in this very early point in history. They just use it to amplify a shot or two of something that's not a character, because trying to do characters in CGI at this point, and for a couple of decades afterwards in Disney's case, isn't something they can nail yet.
The core idea of this sequence has a lot of potential, but it's mutilated is the only way I can sort of say it. Like, it feels very choppy. The editing is very bad. And even if the editing wasn't that bad, actually, it is missing key components. The stuff that's there is good, but there's not the components to just finish them off, as you say, like the Knights of the Realm, or any clear goal for these skeletons. But, as I say, the Rising Army of the Dead, I'd say it looks alright. Again, minus that echo effect. I'd argue it's kind of on par with the Lord of the Rings Army of the Dead, but that is arguably the worst part of those films.
And looking into the production history of this seems like one of the sections that was most heavily cut back because they wanted it to be family friendly and not too dark, but you've got to replace that with something, otherwise it's just hollow.
So our heroes are done for. They're chained up. The Horned King has achieved his goal. I mean, he's left them to it. He's done the Bond villain thing of just be like, it'll be fine. They'll die, I imagine. And he's gone to look out over his balcony. But as far as we're aware, the heroes are doomed.
But lo and behold, who's that to come to save the day, Liam?
It's Rip Taylor. It's good. Honestly, he looks just like him. It's so weird. It's not even a particularly good person to base a character for your children's film off. I said that they did that with Hercules, didn't they? With Hermes, it's just based off Paul Schaefer. It's like, why?
Yes.
So yes, Gurgi comes to rescue them in whatever way he is capable of.
This is meant to be the climax of Gurgi's character arc, where Taran's constantly having a go at him for being a coward. I don't know if Gurgi's a coward as such. He's not willing to do something that he knows he's not equipped to do, which I don't think is unreasonable. But I suppose if Taran only did things he was equipped to do, he wouldn't do anything. From Taran's perspective, that's cowardice. And Gurgi realizes that the best thing he can do with his existence is to climb into the cauldron and die.
Gurgi first frees Taran, and Taran says, Gurgi, help the others. I know what I need to do. So Taran is realizing that he's going to be the one to make the sacrifice. Again, it could be a good moment. I guess there's some growth there. I say growth, it's probably just realization that he's pointless.
Yeah, this climax basically comes down to Gurgi and Taran arguing over whose life is less valuable.
Which Gurgi wins because he argues that unlike Gurgi, Taran has friends, and no one disagrees.
I think Taran actually wins this in a roundabout sense because
He gets to live and is rid of Gurgi.
well, that's definitely a factor. I was going to say that if Taran was a better character and a better person, he wouldn't let Gurgi do it. But as soon as Gurgi says, no, I'll go instead, he goes, yeah, right. Because he's a terrible person. Once again, he is figuratively throwing the pig off the castle.
You know, I don't know, because I don't think I'm a terrible person. But if I was in that situation where I was willing to sacrifice myself and Gurgi came along and was like, no, I'll do it instead, I think I also would be like, yeah, go on then.
Yeah, actually, you make a good point. Even if Gurgi was like, no, I don't think I should, I'd be like, actually, I think you should, Gurgi. If it took hours to convince him, I'd do it.
So yeah, Gurgi throws himself into the Black Cauldron, which not only deactivates its power, but reverses it, so everything dies, and suddenly the cauldron starts sucking everything back in.
Not exactly everything back in, it just sort of starts vaguely pulling stuff towards it in the room, which again is weird. Taran is sort of in a bit of a perilous position, and the Horned King comes in when he sees his armies are falling apart. There's a little moment I like where he's like shouting at the skeletons that are just on the floor doing nothing, and he's like commanding them. There's something very nihilistic and dark about that moment.
Yeah, again, those elements that ring true with the dark 80s high fantasy, they can work, but they're just so out of place, and there's also not enough of them, and they're mostly just meaningless. But yeah, the Horned King realizes what's happened. His little creeper friend suggests that maybe the cauldron just needs another sacrifice. First of all, it didn't start with a sacrifice, it started with some bones. But honestly, little creeper mate, you've walked into that one.
Yeah, we've skinned over Creeper a lot. He's in a lot of scenes, but he's unbearable.
Creeper's such a strange addition. He's not really comic relief. He's there as kind of an extension of the Horned King to do and say things that the Horned King otherwise can't, and for the Horned King to voice off of. Everything always comes back to Lord of the Rings with fantasy, but I feel like you compare this to something like Saruman and Grima, and that relationship and that dynamic works. This just doesn't, because the Horned King is a nothing character and Creeper is a pathetic, worthless character. And I'm like, why are these two mates?
I think they should have gone either way on it, and they should have either made Creeper a serious character or made the Horned King a lighter character. I think the latter would have been the worst call, but look at something like Jafar in Iago, where he's got a wisecracking sidekick, but Jafar's quite a funny character as well, even though he's quite a serious character. Like, he's funny and entertaining. I think if they wanted a sidekick for the Horned King, he should have been maybe absolutely silent and menacing. He's a proper henchman, and he's kind of the muscle to the Horned King's more sort of plotting approaches, but we get what we get.
I'm now just picturing Jafar with an army of undead skeletons.
I think if things had worked out slightly differently at the end of Aladdin, that's probably where it would have gone eventually. But back to the Black Cauldron then.
Oh.
So come on, we're almost there. It's kind of sucking things towards it, and the Horned King decides he's going to throw Taran into it, and he says, you will satisfy the cauldron's hunger. And then the finale is Taran's holding onto a pillar and trying not to get sucked in. The Horned King slowly ambles towards him. Taran gently kicks him in the stomach. The Horned King throws him closer to the cauldron. Then, despite the fact he's further away, the Horned King is sucked in instead, and his skin all melts, although I didn't think he had skin because he's like a skull, but fine, I guess. And he's sucked into the cauldron instead. Why the cauldron started sucking things in, we don't know. There's no explanation.
Again, Taran doesn't do anything heroic here. I feel the Horned King it's his own fault he ends up in the cauldron. I did have a theory that his vision's off because he's adjusting to now suddenly having pupils.
Yes. He gets red pupils in this scene.
His depth perception is just completely gone, and he ends up tripping into the cauldron.
I mean, I've said it a few times, but the plot in this film is entirely driven by people falling over.
I do think the animation on the Horned King's death is pretty cool. Again, if they were going for a family film, this is one of the things you tone down, not chopping huge swaths of the plot out.
They should have gone either way on it, but this is what we get. And again, that's often why in Disney films you have the sort of unseen villain death, is because you can imply something really horrible, but if you don't show it, that's okay. And here, they show it, and it doesn't work. Great.
Does the castle collapse? Somehow they end up back in the swamp.
Yes, it does collapse. It does collapse.
That doesn't make any sense because it's not his castle.
But the cauldron sucks it in, maybe? Oh, God. Bear in mind, I've seen this film multiple times. Once very recently, and I still can't describe it.
So, yeah, everyone somehow survives the castle imploding on itself, and the Black Cauldron menacingly plops up from the water because big heavy iron cauldrons float.
It's like the end of Jumanji where it just washes up. It's back. Now, before we move to the climax of this film, I don't think this film makes any sense in terms of plot, and I actually think there's a case to say the plot makes more sense if you reverse the events of the film up to this point. Right? So, you've got an evil cauldron, it spews out an evil castle, and the Horned King comes out of it.
And Gurgi.
Then his undead army retreat and collapse, so he has to find something to bring them back to life. The cauldron also spews out Gurgi, which drives the characters to the witches. The Horned King sends the Black Cauldron out to restore its power to the witches. They take it and give Taran a magic sword, so he actually earns the sword rather than just bumbling into it. He takes that and finds Henwin, who is hidden with the fairies. They then break into the Horned King's castle to get Henwin, and then at the end, Taran returns back to being a humble pig farmer. It's not a good plot, and it's got tons of holes in, but it makes at least as much sense as the actual one.
The most believable part of the reversed plot is that as soon as the bard gets captured, they just leave him there.
So, the Black Cauldron has now lost its power, so the witches return and they say they're going to take it back.
Why?
Well, yeah, because it doesn't have any power, so why do they want it back? Maybe they're collectors, fine.
I judge the witches, but I just looked up and on my shelf in front of me is a corrupted hard drive I've had for 5 years. They're hoarders. That's what it is. The witches are going to take it back, and again, each character gets one kind of heroic moment, and in this case, the bard turns around and says, we don't give, we trade.
Which is a callback to what the witches say to them originally, and I'm like, is this meant to be he's become like confident and sassy now? And I was like, no, Ben, no, they just needed some dialogue.
And so the witches offer to give Taran the sword back, which, what a terrible trade they've made. In the space of about a couple of hours for them, they gave away a Black Cauldron in exchange for a sword, and then gave the sword back for a worse version of the Black Cauldron.
Liam, I'm racking my brains to try and find a justification for this, but then I've realised there's no explanation or justification. That's what you get. The plot doesn't make any sense. Don't worry about it.
So Taran is offered the chance to take this sword back, and he just doesn't know what to do with it, because he's finally realised, I'm not a warrior, I'm a pig farmer. And they tell him, look, with this sword you could be a great hero. And then he says, we've gone from the best line in the film about an oracular pig to the worst line of the film, where Taran says, hero, I'm no hero, Gurgi was the hero.
It's astonishing. When I first watched this film, I was like, oh my god, Gurgi is the worst Disney character ever. And literally the finale of this film is, Gurgi is a titan among men, or weird dog monkeys, whatever he is.
Everything about this film is just a bad version of Lord of the Rings, isn't it? Imagine if the ending of The Lord of the Rings was Gollum purposefully taking the ring from Frodo and jumping in to sacrifice himself. Be like, I'll save you, master.
And then Frodo wishing that Gollum was back. That's what this scene would be.
Because yes, the trade that they make is, we want Gurgi back. And the witches say, it can't be done. That's impossible. To which they taunt them and say, oh, so you're not all powerful after all. And they show that actually it can be done. I have a theory that this is why the genie won't bring people back from the dead. He says it's not pretty, and I think by that he means people use it to bring Gurgi back. I used to do it as a wish. People kept wasting it on weird little annoying monkey dogs.
And again, even in the knackered internal logic of this film, the cauldron stops working if someone climbs in. So if Gurgi climbs out, does that mean the cauldron works again? And also, for the people of this world, admittedly there's only 5 plus the barbarians, the witches seem like a way bigger threat than the Horned King. They control life and death, they can seemingly do anything, and the Horned King, who's just sort of shambly old man who is defeated by falling over, he's not a threat. The all-powerful witches are. And they live near a TK Maxx.
I will say they might not be all-powerful. It might not be Gurgi. The characters didn't spend that much time with him. If they just replaced it with another monkey dog thing.
Well, I was thinking this because you said earlier, how do they keep bumping into Gurgi? Maybe Gurgi is like the name of that species, and there's 4 or 5 in the film.
You've just made this film much worse.
And that's it. Gurgi's back, and they're all very happy for some reason. Bear in mind, I'm not just criticising this because Gurgi's a terrible character. I criticised this in the Jungle Book when Baloo says he loves Mowgli, and he's known him for like 2 hours. This is the same thing. Anyway, they walk off into the
wilds.
Yeah, the weird dark sky, presumably back to the pig farm. And then we see the pig farmer and the angry fairy from earlier going, "You've done well, Taran." And I was thinking, what have you been watching?
Yeah, my last thought is just, no, he hasn't.
Unless he's thinking, "You've done well, Taran. You're miles away from me," which is what I wanted.
Because clearly, he's fine having the pig back. He's got the pig back. He's not worried about the pig being in the cottage. Maybe the oracular pig was like, the only way you can get rid of Taran is sending us both on this adventure. And he's like, that's what I'll have to do then.
So maybe Torben's really the hero here because he's had to give up something powerful like Henwin to get rid of Taran. He's the one who's made the real sacrifice.
But then, as with all sacrifices in this film, he gets it back anyway.
And that is the Black Cauldron. Christ.
I've mentioned this before, but this was one of my favourite films as a kid. I watched this a lot, and I think it's because young Liam had no taste. As an adult, I've often wondered, are the problems with the Black Cauldron to do with the genre itself? Because I can't think of any other genre where I love the aesthetic more, but basically all of the storytelling is universally terrible. I think when it comes to high fantasy, ever since Tolkien, it's all just a bit shit.
Certainly in terms of cinema, I'm not saying there's no good fantasy films. Maybe that is what I'm saying. But I suppose the problem is fantasy as a genre tends to be very verbose and long, and probably one of the reasons it's not worked in cinema is because they're trying to truncate so much lore, which is a big part of fantasy, into a very small running time. And maybe that's the reason it works in a TV show format a lot better, or a video game format like The Witcher.
Sorry, you're absolutely right. I should specify I'm talking mostly in cinema here, and with Tolkien again, it's the fact that they were able to create a series of films that actually worked. Because, yeah, there's so much world building and so much suspension of disbelief you have to do that there's not much room left to tell good stories. And I don't think that's actually the problem here, because if you look at it, the world building is terrible. Like, there's no mention of these wars. The characters that we meet, they don't tell a story about the world. And then the actual story is still ripped out and butchered and put back in this horrible, messy way.
Before we give our final thoughts on the Black Cauldron, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about?
We first need to decide which character we think is the sexiest character in the entire Black Cauldron. Now, I think we can both agree it's definitely not Taran, it's definitely not Gurgi. Leaves us with a few characters left. So Ben, who is the sexiest character in the Black Cauldron?
So, I guess in terms of sexy, none of them, they're all obnoxious and awful. In terms of most sexualised, which is often what we go to when there's not an obvious choice, you mentioned there's belly dancer type character in the bandits. It's not really clear what the design of that character is. There's that. I think they're drawn in quite a grotesque way. I think they're more a comedy grotesque than a proper engaging character. Same with the aforementioned unnecessarily busty witch. So I'm going to go with Henwin the pig.
I was wondering whether you were going to get to Henwin, so please explain why Henwin is the most sexy character.
Obviously, this is in very relative terms here. Some of the other characters we've looked at, it's because they've got the long eyelashes and all that sort of stuff. Henwin kind of has that Cleo the fish thing going on, so I think that's the best call I can make with very poor options.
I'm going to agree with you, and I'm going to add an extra bit of supporting evidence, which, if you don't think the character is overtly sexualized, there are scenes fairly early on when Taran and Henwin are walking together where it's clearly a different animator, and what they've drawn there is just a normal pig. And then when you get back to Henwin in close-ups, you're like, oh, that is a sexy pig. You've now seen a normal pig, so it then stands out more when you see the sexy pig. So yeah, I'm going to agree and say it's Henwin.
So obviously this isn't going on the list. I guess in terms of my final thoughts, when I first did the watch several years ago of all the Disney animated classics, I ranked them all and I put the Black Cauldron dead last because, as I've made clear, I don't think there's any element of it that works. I don't think there's anything good in this film. I think any perception you might have of this film, either from watching a trailer or childhood memories, I think you'd just be really disappointed. And I genuinely don't even think it works as a so bad it's good, come and look at this car crash of a film, because it's just boring and confusing. It's not insane, ridiculous misses that they've made here. This isn't something like Chicken Little or Home on the Range where it's what the hell were they thinking? This is such a big change in direction. This is just something that's just dull and wasn't made very well. There was a mess behind the scenes, and what you get on the screen is an even bigger mess.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. The key word is dull, and I still have no idea how it managed to entertain me as a child. But my word, I think that says more about me than anything else, really. Like, I'm the guilty party in that scenario. It's a bad film, and it doesn't deserve to go anywhere near the list.
It was a real low point for Disney. I think the 80s and the 70s were a difficult time for Disney. They'd lost their direction. This film at the time being made was the most expensive film ever. It didn't even make back half its budget, which is insane. It was weirdly fairly well reviewed on average, although I think nowadays when people look back they can see that this film is a horrible mess. But as I mentioned earlier, Ron Clements and John Musker walked away from this film to work on something else, and that's what we're looking at next time. Liam, what film is that?
Next time, we are going to be taking a deep dive into the wonderful world of Basil the Great Mouse Detective. Now, many years ago, this is one of, if not the first Disney films we watched together. So I feel that I have experienced firsthand your feelings on this film, but I have to say I'm definitely looking forward to revisiting this in my own time and seeing how you feel about it and if whether that's changed.
Yeah, I'm excited to revisit it as well. But in the meantime, of course, our views on the Black Cauldron are just two sets of views, and we are always keen to hear what other people think. Obviously, you may cherish this film in the same way a lot of people do, where they watched it as a child and maybe haven't revisited it since. Maybe you agree and think we're right to characterise it as a dumpster fire full of money. Let us know if you think Henwin is or isn't the sexiest character, and should they have put songs in this film, how would you have fixed the Black Cauldron?
I've just realised that the first Disney film to not feature any songs actually has a bard in it, and it would have been so easy to incorporate it, but no. Once again, another misstep on the already colossal list of missteps this film has made. And so, remember to give The Great Mouse Detective a watch and join us next time for Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.